The hit that took out Durban's drug boss son, Devendren Lionel Pillay. Chapter 1. A Ruthless Ambush. Devendren Lionel Pillay, known as Biggs, was no stranger to the streets of Durban. On a quiet Thursday night, the air was shattered by the rapid fire of gunshots outside a home in Shallcross. Biggs, 38, had just stepped out of his vehicle when bullets tore through the night. The gunman showed no mercy, spraying the area with bullets before speeding away. Chaos erupted as onlookers screamed and ducked for cover. Among them was Claudine Rampersad, an innocent bystander caught in the deadly crossfire. Blood pooled on the pavement as frantic calls for help filled the air. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the damage was done. Both Biggs and Claudine had suffered fatal wounds. Rushed to the hospital, Biggs fought for his life as his family and associates gathered in distress. Claudine's family, too, was left in shock, their world turned upside down by a crime they had no part in. By nightfall, news of the attack spread like wildfire, shaking Durban's underworld. Pillay's father, Teddy Mafia, a notorious figure himself, was no stranger to violence, but this hit struck deep. Hours later, the hospital confirmed what many had feared: Biggs was dead. His father's empire had lost its heir, and the streets whispered of revenge. Chapter 2. A Funeral of Power and Fear. The Shallcross community was in mourning, but the funeral felt more like a show of force. Hundreds gathered, many clad in expensive suits, dark sunglasses, and heavy gold chains. The scent of incense mixed with the aroma of expensive colognes as high-powered vehicles lined the street. There was an unspoken tension in the air, grief, anger, and vengeance intertwined. Some whispered about retaliation, others about the enemies Biggs had made in his lifetime. His family sat at the front, their expressions unreadable, hardened by years in the game. Pillay's associates, men who had worked closely with him, stood in groups, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats. The atmosphere wasn't just about mourning, it was about power. Biggs' death had left a vacuum, and everyone knew the consequences of such a void. The presence of heavily armed security guards made it clear. This was no ordinary funeral. This was a reminder of who the Pillay family was and what they stood for. No one dared to speak ill of the dead, but beneath the surface, speculation ran wild. Had Biggs been betrayed? Was this a war between rival factions? His enemies had struck a devastating blow, but the Pillay name wasn't one to fade quietly. Chapter 3. A Procession of Loyalty and Tears. The wait for Biggs remains felt endless. The crowd stood in eerie silence as the hearse approached, escorted by luxury cars and bodyguards. In a symbolic act of respect, Torres Street was shut down, transformed into sacred ground for the fallen son. White tents filled the road, shielding mourners from the Durban sun. When the casket finally arrived, the atmosphere shifted, anger and sorrow collided in an overwhelming wave. 12 men, handpicked for their loyalty, lifted the coffin. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable. Leading them was a Scottish bagpiper, his mournful tune echoing through the streets. As they moved forward, women wept openly, while men, toughened by the realities of their world, fought back tears. Some mourners wore white t-shirts emblazoned with TMS, Teddy Mafia Son, and an image of Biggs holding machine guns. It was a statement, a message. Biggs wasn't just another man, he was a symbol. Even in death, his presence loomed over the crowd. Armed guards flanked the procession, their fingers resting near their triggers. In this world, grief and danger walked hand in hand. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Legacy. For years, Biggs had been known for his ties to the underworld, but he also ran a successful trucking business. His father, Teddy Mafia, spoke of his son's last hours with a mixture of pain and conviction. Biggs had gone to the bank that morning, transferring money to keep his business running. Fuel for his trucks, payroll for his workers, he had responsibilities beyond the streets. His enemies, however, didn't care about that. They saw him as his father's son, a man tied to a world of crime and power. Despite past allegations, Pillay insisted his son wasn't the man the media painted him to be. He had his troubles, yes, but he wasn't a monster, he said, his voice heavy with grief. But the streets had their own stories, and in their world, debts were paid in blood. The past never truly stayed buried. Was this hit about old grudges, unpaid dues, or simply an attempt to shift power in Durban's criminal underworld? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain: Biggs' death was no random act. Chapter 5. The Moment the Bullets Rained. That afternoon, Biggs had stopped by a friend's place near the spot where Claudine Rampersad was also shot. It was a routine visit, nothing unusual, until fate intervened. As he walked toward his car, a voice called out. A woman who hadn't seen him in years greeted him excitedly. Smiling, Biggs turned to respond, his guard momentarily lowered. That's when the attack happened. Out of nowhere, a dark-colored vehicle sped past, windows rolling down just enough for the assassins to take aim. The first shot rang out, followed by a barrage of bullets. Biggs barely had time to react as lead tore through his body. The woman who had greeted him screamed, ducking for cover as glass shattered around her. Onlookers ran, some diving behind walls, others too stunned to move. The gunmen didn't hesitate, they had done their job. Tires screeched, and the car disappeared, leaving behind a street littered with bullet casings and blood. Chapter 6. A Calculated Execution. Biggs wasn't just killed, he was hunted. His murder wasn't some drive-by mistake or a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was clean, quick, and frighteningly precise. His father, Teddy Pillay, was convinced the gunman had been tracking his son for days, maybe even weeks, before striking. There were no stray bullets, no panicked getaway. Only cold calculation and brutal efficiency. The shooters knew where Biggs would be, what route he'd take, and exactly when to strike. This wasn't random, Pillay said with a clenched jaw. Someone wanted him dead, and they made sure it happened. He'd seen his fair share of violence, but this felt different. This felt personal. Had his son's name been added to a hit list in some backroom meeting? Was this retribution for a deal gone wrong, or a message meant to shake the Pillay family's foundation? No one had answers, but Pillay wasn't naive enough to think this was over. The killers had disappeared as fast as they came, like ghosts in the night. No CCTV. No witnesses. No trace. The police promised an investigation, but their words rang hollow in a world where silence was currency. If they do their job properly, they'll find the men who did this, Pillay told reporters, but even he didn't believe that. In the underworld, justice didn't wear a badge. It carried silencers, moved in shadows, and made statements in blood. The streets remembered. And in Pillay's world, debts were never forgotten, only delayed. Rumors buzzed like flies around fresh meat. Names floated through the grapevine, whispered with hesitation. Some said it was a rival crew trying to cut into Pillay territory. Others said it was a betrayal from within. Pillay said nothing publicly, but privately, a list was being written. One by one, names were added, not based on evidence, but instinct. He replayed the night in his mind again and again, looking for something he missed. Biggs had been careful, but maybe too visible, maybe too confident, or maybe he had trusted the wrong person. Pillay knew that in this world, loyalty had an expiry date. And now, the game had changed. He wasn't just mourning a son, he was preparing for war. And in war, mercy was weakness. Chapter 7, Blood and Grief. The funeral was a spectacle of sorrow and tension. Hundreds arrived, family, friends, enemies masked as mourners. The air was thick with emotion, grief wrapped around every face like a funeral veil. When the coffin was lowered into the earth, a sharp, agonizing wail cut through the air. Pillay's wife, Susan, collapsed at the edge of the grave, screaming her son's name like a prayer no one could answer. "Wake up, Lionel. Come back to me," she sobbed, her fists pounding against the lid of the coffin as if she could break it open with love and desperation. Her cries cracked something inside everyone who heard them. Men who had once stood tall in battle now bowed their heads. Armed guards looked around nervously, hands twitching near their weapons, watching for signs of retaliation. Even here, no one knew if the killers were in attendance, watching from afar, or hiding among the crowd. Pillay stood still, a statue of rage and pain. His sunglasses masked his eyes, but his clenched fists told the story. Around him, murmurs rippled. Some spoke of vengeance, others of oaths. Grief had become a breeding ground for rage. As the priest mumbled final prayers, more men arrived. Known faces from the underworld, leaders from different corners of Durban. Their presence was not about respect, it was a statement. They weren't just there to say goodbye. They were there to see how the king would respond. Pillay offered no words. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. As the final shovel of dirt landed on the coffin, a vow spread across the crowd without a word being spoken. This wasn't the end. This was the prologue to something darker. The whispers started before the last car left the cemetery. Who would be first? Who would bleed for this? Who would pay? Susan sat in the car, clutching her son's photo, eyes vacant. Pillay held her hand, but his mind was already somewhere else, calculating, measuring, planning. Grief had lit a fuse inside him. Now all that remained was the explosion. Chapter 8, A Family at War. The air inside the Pillay mansion was electric with unspoken threats and silent anger. Teddy Pillay sat at the head of the long dining table, his family surrounding him. His face was unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. "We will need extra security. My children must be protected," he said, looking at each of them in turn. There was no room for fear now, only strategy. Biggs was gone, but the family had to endure. The death had sent shockwaves not just through the Pillays, but through Durban's entire criminal ecosystem. Alliances were shifting. Loyalties were being questioned. A power vacuum was forming, and vultures were circling. "This was not the right thing to do," Pillay said, eyes narrowing. "But it will be the last wrong move they ever make." His voice was low but full of fire, a threat dressed as prophecy. No arrests had been made, and Pillay wasn't holding his breath. He'd seen enough to know how justice worked in their world. Official channels moved too slow, if at all. But the underworld had its own mechanisms. Money spoke. Fear whispered. Blood sealed the deal. He had resources, connections, and loyal men ready to act. He didn't need a trial. He needed targets. Plans were drawn. Locations were scouted. Information was traded like weapons. Pillay's men worked around the clock, making calls, shaking trees, and watching who flinched. His daughters were moved to a safe house. His younger son, barely 18, was assigned 2 bodyguards. Trust was a rare currency now, and it was dwindling fast. Pillay's empire was built on loyalty, but even that had cracks. He had to tighten his circle, reevaluate his alliances, and prepare for the next wave. Because this wasn't just an attack on his son, it was a challenge to his legacy. And if there was one thing Pillay couldn't tolerate, it was disrespect. In Durban's underworld, silence wasn't peace. It was a loaded gun with a silencer. By nightfall, orders had been issued. Names were being tracked. The Pillay family, once fractured by grief, was now bound by vengeance. A family in mourning had become a family at war.